Alrighty. Hello again,
Hey,
sir.
what's up, sir? How you doing?
I'm very well. So this will be episode number 3
Nice.
of our podcast, which is it means that we're following through on this. It seems like we're actually, we said we were going to do something, we're doing it, and I'm feeling good about it. I spoke to a couple of people about the content that we produced, and they said that rather than focusing, exclusively on the legislation, we've kind of been talking about a number of different things because there's a lot going on in the world of marijuana that we need to discuss, such as like current events, the articles that are coming forward. You illumined me to 2 things this week that were very relevant that we're going to talk about a little bit. Justice Thomas,
Yes.
as
Surprisingly.
well, we're going to get into that. But the point is, I think ultimately I'm going to have to start doing 3 types of episodes. One that's analyzing current events and what people are writing. And then I also want to do a podcast specifically about business strategy. So we're kind of weaving everything into the analysis of the legislation for now. That's just, that's how we're doing it. So
and this is new. We're figuring it out. It's not like we had some sort of a pre-configured game plan. We're like, okay, how does this look? And we're getting feedback from people as we go on, and we're responding to the feedback.
Yeah, but if this is your first time tuning in, basically, hello and thank you for joining us. But we're analyzing the marijuana legislation in New York, and we're going through the entire legislation from beginning to end. So the first episode we introduced ourselves.
Right.
Last week we
Kind of like a prologue.
Yeah, we talked about who we are. I'm a lawyer. You're a tech person. We're
a business consultant.
Right. And more than tech. And I've actually, I think, deliberately kept some of what you do vague because you gotta pay us to become one of our clients for us to tell you all of our secrets. So
and also I don't want to bore you to tears out there, so that's a little part of it too.
Right. So last week we finally started to get into the legislation a little bit. We spoke on the introduction. Basically, they talked about kind of all the different areas of law that the statute touches upon.
Yes.
This week we're going to actually dive into the substantive law.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to talk. It's going to get a little bit more complicated and difficult. So. This is our first podcast where we're actually gonna do some heavy lifting.
Yes.
So,
and for those of you keeping score at home, what we're referring to is what's known as the MRTA, or the Marijuana Reform and Taxation Act.
And what we're going to read in the statute today is it can be called the Cannabis Law for short. No, but you'll see it. It says that in the legislation.
And let's be honest, people, that's what you're all going to call it, because that sounds a whole lot more sexy, and it's just easier to say than the MRTA. Good God, that clearly you can see that's the title the lawyers came up with. Just saying. No offense.
None taken. But I do want to just highlight that not everybody on the legislature who worked on the statute is a lawyer. Okay. So there's definitely the influence of.
So you mean there are legislators that aren't lawyers?
Of course, you know that. Right? You're
I'm
just
being facetious.
Yeah. Well, I think some people don't necessarily know but there's really no qualifications to becoming a legislator other than getting voted in. So we're going to get into that.
I'm not going to go there, folks. You know the obvious bait. I'm not going to.
The only thing I wanted to highlight is what you brought up to me about Justice Thomas, and that basically the most conservative justice on the United States Supreme Court seems to support universal legislation, right?
Yeah, on a federal level.
On a federal level. So that's good news for everybody. That what that means is that even the and Justice Thomas, for anybody who doesn't know, is like would you say he's the most conservative justice?
I would say probably consistently, because even some like Scalia and Kavanaugh even and Roberts have surprised people and gone with decisions that you would have thought, going strictly down the conservative playbook, they would have gone that way. But usually, if there's a dissent and it's a conservative dissent, or if there's a conservative ruling, Thomas is pretty much firmly in the conservative corner.
Yeah, and interestingly, he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected or anything like that.
True.
So if he's going to draft an opinion, that it's his. It's coming from his sincere, thinking about what the law should be.
And this is why it's significant, folks, because basically what he said was, look, given how many states have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes, which I believe is something like 36.
I don't know exactly.
And there's last count, it was 18. It might be more than that right now, but in fact, in our last episode, Connecticut just became the 18th state to legalize for recreational use. And he said, at this point, what are federal laws doing? We're inconsistent. Why are we wasting our time? On the one hand, the Department of Justice tells them stand down, don't prosecute states. Law enforcement officials on the federal level are being told not to prosecute, and yet the Internal Revenue Service, which is really what he was commenting on, is still penalizing people at the state law in terms of marijuana.
So this dovetails. The reason why I brought this up is because I want to highlight my overarching business strategy in every single episode, and I am going to have podcasts that go into a little bit more detail, but it's actually very simple. My strategy is, and the strategy that I counsel other people, is that if you're in the business of selling marijuana in New York or even in a jurisdiction where it's not legal, you should do so openly, honestly, transparently. You should record everything for your taxes, and you should begin to start making charitable contributions with discretionary revenue to make yourself a good corporate citizen and an attractive person to the government. And the other thing is that we should all begin to come together for the purposes of collective bargaining. Yeah. That's my marijuana strategy in a nutshell.
And the interesting thing is, seeing as I'm talking to a lawyer here, you would appreciate this. The two terms de facto versus de jure. Mm-hmm. And basically what Sean is saying is, for those of you out there, even in a place where it's not de jure legal, behave as if de facto it is legal.
Within certain caveats. Like there was an arrest recently where people were transporting several...
at airports, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not saying that you should do things that are...
Don't have suitcases full of weed and ship them through a conventional airline baggage handling.
No.
That's just dumb.
I mean, I think the safest thing to be doing is to be growing in the, within the state, not to necessarily be transporting from one state to another. If that's what you're doing, again, try to respect that law. It's still not 100% legal, but at the same time, don't hide it.
Right.
If you're filing your taxes, say I made, X amount of money last year, and, I'm
here's
paying...
where the revenue came from.
I'm paying my taxes. I've made, charitable contributions. This is what I'm doing. I have a staff of people. And especially if you begin to come together, like I said, for the purposes of collective bargaining, then it makes pressure from law enforcement much more complicated, right? Because then if they're going after one person, they're essentially going after an entire class, right? So if you're in a jurisdiction where it's not legal, and even if there were a small number, like 100 people in the marijuana industry working together, from a collective bargaining standpoint, you have more power when you negotiate with the legislature. So that's essentially...
And it's time to come out of the... Well, it's
I know what you're going to
say. It's time to come out of the closet, folks. Mm-hmm. Look, if 36 states have medicinal marijuana and half that number have recreational marijuana, give me a state where people aren't smoking weed. And as we've discussed in many episodes, I have been straight edge since 2016. This is now the 4th of July, 2021 as we're making this recording. So, and again, I didn't do a 12-step program. I didn't go into rehab. I just, I'm 60 years old. So after, 40 years, I figured it was a good run. However, I'm still here on these podcasts, and I'm still partnering with Sean because I believe that marijuana should be legal. Not only because it's just ridiculous. I mean, if you can smoke cigarettes and drink a beer, I see no reason why you can't smoke weed. But that's not why I'm here advocating it. And as one of the primary drivers of Sean's argument, just from the revenue purposes alone, every state that has legalized marijuana has reaped a boon, a benefit in terms of tax revenues.
Well, and the other reason why you're partnering with me and why I'm so interested in this is it's not exclusively about money. There are social implications here that are very significant, historic even. We are trying to make this conversation about reparations, among other things.
Yes.
The statute definitely spells out certain sections in such a way as to seem to direct the conversation toward reparations. We're making that explicit, you and I.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why I think it's it's attractive to me. It's attractive to you.
And we're taking the government at its word, rather than looking at the government as adversarial, as the enemy, the bad guys. We're saying, okay, on paper, you say that this is as much about social equity as it is about simple, reform from a revenue purpose. So we're going to behave, and we're going to regard you as if that's really your motivation until proven otherwise.
Which is, again, when I say to be open and transparent, it's to use the statute as the shield. Whereas in the past, you were essentially trying to evade law enforcement, evade the legislature, evade anything that has anything to do with government. That ain't our friends. Now I'm saying, you know what? Let's take a different approach. Let's say, I'm not going to sit here and say that all branches of government are the same, or that everybody in government is your friend. I mean,
but that's not the case.
But the sponsors of this bill, the Democrats who sponsored this bill, I think they've done something that even the Republicans, if they really examine it, could agree with. And the reason why they're digging their heels in the sand is more, just the political.
It's partisanship.
Partisanship.
Plain and simple.
And there are aspects of the legislation that we're going to analyze that, maybe we could take a more conservative approach. But even if we were to, I still think that as a piece of legislation, it is something that the Republicans should respect. Sure. It's something that it's something that everyone should respect. It's something that people down the middle should certainly respect, and even the fringe extremes on the left and the right should basically say, you know what.
And let's not get caught up, because let's say, because even now we're speaking into the dichotomy of conservative liberal. Let's broaden that conversation. Let's say you're someone down the middle. Let's say you're a libertarian. Let's say you're an independent or undecided. And let's say that your issue is, well, you're talking about drugs, and I don't know about that marijuana. This is what we're talking about. We have to move past that level of conversation. People, historically, indulge in intoxicants. That's what we like to do. That's why there's bars and pubs. That's why people smoke cigarettes, even though they know that it has a deleterious health effect on them. And one of the things in our initial conversations before we started this all up, when Sean came to me, he says, look, America was formed on rum and tobacco. Let's stop pretending. It's always been about the intoxicants. So in a lot of ways, we're getting back to America's roots.
Well, I think that's exactly what we're doing. Not just in terms of the source of the revenue itself, but in terms of how we're going to approach it from in terms of how we wanted to build the economy. We're going back to traditional principles of economics, and this is where I think the Republicans could really bring a lot to the conversation. How do we manage this in the most profitable way possible? How do we make sure that the taxable revenue is dispersed appropriately? Because
there's a lot to consider here, folks. This is not going to be like we're going to. It's going to take the New York State Legislature 12 to 18 months just to figure out how to implement a bill that's already written.
Well, and we're going to understand why, and I think that now is a good time for us to begin to approach the legislation. I mean, we could continue to talk about this at the high level. There's a lot to discuss, but let's But
each week we are trying to get into something substantive.
We are, and you're going to see. So last week, we had a pretty we spoke at length, kind of in introductory. We didn't dive too deeply into the statute itself. No. So this week we're going to dive into the statute. So last week, the only thing that we did review was the introduction, which essentially kind of listed all of the different areas of law that the statute is going to affect, from the obvious criminal law to the less obvious, Family Court Act. It basically lists, all the different segments of the law that are going to have to
and even
adjust.
The definition of marijuana as to whether it's a Schedule I drug, these sorts of things.
Right.
So it was rather comprehensive, and that was just basically the introduction to the act. We didn't really dive into it itself. And again, this is something that Sean mentioned last week, that he feels that New York has done an exemplary job in terms of its marijuana legislature compared to other states.
So I can't read every single act in all the jurisdictions. That's not possible. I wish I had a staff of people and we could do that, but that's not possible. The ones I did review, however, the introductory remarks were very limited. They did not spell out in as much detail what the New York legislature did. But now we're going to get into some more. So again, the introduction just spells out the different areas of law that this touches upon. Now we're going to get into what has the legislature found in terms of why they're drafting this law. So, Article 1, Section 1, short title. This chapter shall be known and may be cited and referred to as the Cannabis Law. So we said that in the beginning.
Yes.
There's a section just to that, so we can call this the Cannabis Law. All right. So legislative finding and intent. The legislature finds that existing marijuana laws... Oh, excuse me, I do want to take a step back. After this section, there's another section that goes into definitions of all the terms. We are not going to... I do want to just highlight where there's legalese that we can kind of summarize. I've read it, digested it, and I will present it in a summarized fashion. And then there are sections that we're probably going to... Like, we don't need to read every single definition. Where most of the definitions are just the ordinary definition that you would understand. Where that's not the case, I will where it's used in a particular section, I will go back to it and discuss it. Okay?
Because we're not trying to read every single word of the act. That's going to take a long time. It's going to bore you to tears. But we are going to cover the substantive components of this act in detail. Right.
So, again, another example is when they start talking about the Cannabis Board. It's like when they start talking about the voting mechanics. That's not something we need to get into.
We're not going to be voting, so.
Well, it's a Roberts. I don't know if you're familiar with Roberts Rules of Order.
Parliamentary procedure, as most people are familiar with it being referred to as.
And that's essentially just how any large group of people, or even a small group of people, is supposed to operate.
Point of order, chair recognizes the speaker.
How to bring a motion, how to have a quorum. So we don't need to go into all of those details. But so for the legislative finding and intent, the legislature finds that existing marijuana laws have not been beneficial to the welfare of the general public. Yeah. So that's a pretty stark admission right there. Yeah. I mean, that's
worth commenting, not to go into too much detail, but see, they're not saying, it's affected the people who've been arrested or whatever. The general public, that's everybody. That's y'all out there who don't smoke. It hasn't even been beneficial for you, is what they're saying.
They're saying that the marijuana law has not been a good thing. And then they go into the reasons why. Existing laws have been ineffective in reducing or curbing marijuana use. So, do we want to curb marijuana use among adults? Is marijuana a good thing? After years and years of abusing virtually every drug known to civilized man, I can say that marijuana is the safest one relative to tobacco, relative to alcohol. That being said, is it a good thing? I think life would probably be easier for most people if they were simply straight edge.
Yes.
Okay?
And here's the other thing, though. Yeah. Basically what they're saying in that sentence is what this country learned in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. They're saying, remember, constitutionally, alcohol was illegal in this country. And how'd that work out? It didn't. They ended up having to repeal it.
Yes, that's right. And it was, and there were devastating consequences. They created the mafia. It was
Now imagine drive-by shootings, not with 9mm, with 45 caliber machine guns.
Interestingly, though, while Prohibition was raging in the United States, alcohol was still legal throughout the rest of the world. Whereas marijuana is pretty much illegal across the globe. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's scheduled under the, I forget which provision of international law, but there's a Geneva Convention that because drugs are a global problem, right? Yeah. You want heroin to be classified a certain way, because you don't want it to be traded between nations or whatever. Right. So marijuana has essentially been classed
in that same lumped into that same group of other clearly more harmful
internationally.
Yes.
So whereas the end of Prohibition basically just brought the United States up to speed with the rest of the world,
the Canadian bootleggers kind of lamented that, but that's all.
Was it? Well, it was when it was it prohibited in Canada?
No. That's where a lot of the gin and booze that people were bootlegging here in the United States
was
came
coming from Canada. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so now though, I'm hoping that the marijuana legislation in the United States helps to relax the prohibition.
We can set a precedent in terms of global leadership.
But it's certainly, as the legislature is saying, if the intent of the marijuana law was to reduce use among adults, it has failed completely because everyone smokes marijuana.
And as we said last week, man, you walk around the streets of New York, man, you could just take a deep breath and get a contact high.
I think at least, to say that 1 million people are regular marijuana smokers in the 5 boroughs would be an...
I'd say that's a reasonable estimate.
I'd say it's a
conservative estimate.
I think it's probably closer to 30, 40, or 50%.
Yeah, it's a lot of
what
people.
percentage of people drink?
That's true.
It's in the same class as alcohol. It is something that adult users... Now,
and most people use it without abusing it.
I don't know.
Dude, all these people that we're seeing here walking around in Chelsea, dude, these soccer moms. And
I think a lot of that is abuse. I do think a lot of it is abuse, and
okay. That's a conversation for a different podcast.
Well, or maybe for now, it's like the goal of the legislation shouldn't necessarily be to stop marijuana use, whereas that is the goal for things like crystal meth, heroin. There is no responsible way to smoke crack. If you're smoking crack, you need to talk to a psychiatrist. It's on its face. It's a serious problem. If you're
now, when I say use without abuse, I'm comparing it to alcohol. Look, a lot of people, most people can drink on an ongoing basis and get up and go to work. Sometimes they're going to get up and they're going to go to work hungover. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're going to take that sick day because they got to call out because they kind of overdid it.
Well, I think what passes for reasonable drinking is abuse. I'm getting more and more conservative, and you're straight edge yourself, so it's not we're not too far.
But that's my own personal decision. Yes. Most of my friends and peers both drink and get high, and it's sort of interesting because they're dealing with me. It's so weird. I hang out with my high school alum in a bar, and they're like, "Oh, do you mind if I drink?" I'm like, "Dude, I'm in a place that is designed specifically to sell alcohol. What do you mean if I object? More for you. I'm not your nanny."
But my point is that I don't think that the goal for marijuana should be to eliminate. It should be to foster reasonable, healthy use among adult users.
Yes.
And I think that for marijuana, that is possible. But even for something like tobacco, that's not possible. If you're using tobacco, you're probably addicted to it and abusing it, and there's devastating consequences. It is possible to smoke marijuana without there being that kind of consequence. So... existing laws ineffective in reducing or curbing marijuana use and have instead resulting in devastating collateral consequences, including mass incarceration and other complex generational trauma that inhibit an otherwise law-abiding citizen's ability to access housing, employment opportunities, and other vital services. I think that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. And that's also interesting language in the law. Basically, they're saying is look, marijuana being illegal has turned people who aren't criminals into criminals solely based on the fact that those laws exist.
Yeah,
it has a ripple effect that affects all aspects of their lives simply because of something that should be regulated in the same way that spirits or alcohol or beer is regulated.
I honestly, and again, I'm putting myself on the vanguard, and I'm not having any secrets here. I've been arrested for marijuana more times than I can remember, and I've never been arrested for anything else. No, that's not true. I did get arrested for hopping the turnstile once, but that was a long time ago when I was young, and I mean, in other words, the only thing that I've ever really gotten in trouble for is smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
That's the only time the police have ever I've ever had an adversarial interaction with the cops is because of marijuana. Other than that, I'm a tax-paying citizen.
Right.
So okay.
Exactly what they're saying in that sentence.
That inhibit otherwise law-abiding citizens' ability to access housing, employment opportunities, and other vital services. I said that. Existing laws have also created an illicit market which represents a threat to public health and reduces the ability of the legislature to deter the accessing of marijuana by minors.
Ah,
Okay, so when it comes to marijuana use by minors, I am very conservative on the
Yes.
subject of alcohol,
yes.
marijuana,
Cigarettes, the
tobacco,
whole thing.
cigarettes, drugs. I mean, I think they set the age at 21, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
Yes.
It's like if under the age of 21, that's not something that I think people should be doing. And now that it's legal, they can, I think, have. I hope to see a reduction
Yes.
in abuse among those
Right.
populations.
As we discussed in
Yeah.
the intervening weeks between last week's episode, like I said, I'm 60 years old. I was born in 1960. So when I was a tween and a teen in the late 60s and early 70s, it was possible for me to go to the local bodega and buy cigarettes and beer for my stepfather. Now, I wasn't smoking at the time. I wasn't drinking it, but any little corner store would do that. Nowadays, especially here in New York City, you go into every store and you see right there next to the cash register, you must be this age. Why? Because they're going to get their license taken away if they sell to underage people.
That's right.
And they're not, for one kid, they're not messing up their revenue because they make serious money selling beer and cigarettes, and they're not going to mess it up. If the same thing happens, they've got a license to sell marijuana, they're not going to mess it up selling it to a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old. They're just not going to go there.
Yeah, it was very hard for us to get alcohol when I was younger. Cigarettes, I don't know why that was so easy, but vendors were more likely to sell us cigarettes than they were to sell us beer. Beer and alcohol was almost impossible for us to get. Cigarettes we found a way to get.
Right.
So again, I think that the state should do everything in its power to keep those substances away from people kids under the age of 21. All right, so. Created an illicit mark. So the laws have created an illicit market, which represents a threat to public health. Is that true? Is the illicit marijuana market a threat to public health in the same way that the illicit marijuana the illicit heroin market is a threat to public health? I'm not.
Not that violent, but let's not pretend that there's no violence in turf wars and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's
not to the extent of, say, coke or heroin.
No.
But it's nowhere near. But it's still there.
I mean, yeah, it's there. I guess it's there, but it's like even when the worst underbelly, dark side of marijuana is not as bad as heroin, cocaine.
No.
It's always been relatively harmless. I think, even in its worst manifestations. Existing marijuana laws have disproportionately impacted African American and Latinx communities. Okay. That's what they found. Those are the bad things that they found. When I finish this section, we're going to go back, and I do think they missed a couple of things, but we're going to go back. We'll come back. The intent of this act. So that's what they found. Right. Now this is what they're trying to do. Regulate, control, and tax marijuana, heretofore known as cannabis, generate significant new revenue, make substantial investment in communities and people most impacted by cannabis criminalization to address the collateral consequences of such criminalization, prevent access to cannabis by those under the age of 21 years, they said that again, reduce the illegal drug market, they said that again, and reduce violent crime. Okay, again,
to the extent that it's an aspect.
How much violent crime is attributable to marijuana? It's like alcohol, cocaine. We'll get drunk and get violent, but marijuana definitely has a pacifying effect on people. I think, which is why the military really doesn't want their people smoking weed because
kind of hard to get them riled up for. But but to the extent that there's any sort of organized underground distribution, you're going to get turf wars, and that's what they're talking about. Now, of course, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get Colombian neckties or cartels putting out hits against entire families. No. But you might have some minor gang related stuff or people. This is my block, this is my corner kind of thing going down.
Yeah, but it's not so serious that I feel that it's. I don't think the legislation is going. I don't think violent crime and the turf wars and the things you're talking about are significant enough that the legalization is actually going to reduce that in any significant way. I don't think we're going to see that. I think that violent crime is more about other things.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we're in agreement there. And then reduce the participation of otherwise law-abiding citizens in the illicit market. They're saying that again. and the racially disparate impact of existing cannabis laws, that is a problem. That's, how many black people versus white people have been arrested for marijuana.
Yeah.
And let's be real, there's a lot more white marijuana smokers than
Yes.
black marijuana smokers just because there's more white people than black
Right.
people. Why are the arrests so disproportionate? And the reason why is because it's like the whole stop and frisk thing.
Yeah.
It's like if a cop sees someone that they want to see if they have weapons, if they see them smoking marijuana, it's a whereas they might, like, if they see a white man with a tie smoking a joint, they might be inclined to look the other way or keep walking. If it's a black guy with baggy pants and listening to, they might want.
They're going to take a different stance,
Right.
and things in this country have been colored, if you will, by the prevailing negative sentiments. Call it systemic racism, whatever you want. As we said in the first episode, that's not the avenue we're looking to go down. But
It's one thing.
It is what it is, and this is what the legislation is directly addressing.
It's one. I think I'm sort of on the libertarian conservative end of the spectrum, and we've had conversations about race where it was not this conversation,
right?
But now I think this is an opportunity for us to make meaningful strides towards ending not all but not racism generally, but to create systems and to put to what we said last week was to blue line the red line, right? To start to take steps towards dismantling what the left.
Because this isn't a panacea. This isn't a quick fix, one size fits all, universal solution. This is a step in the right direction, which is why we're spending this time and effort to go into this in such detail. It's going to take many more things like this. This is a generational problem in the creation.
But it's a step in the right direction, man.
Yes.
It's at least now we can say we did this.
It's strides in the right direction. It's not baby steps.
It's not another, but it's like if you look at the history of race in this country, it's kind of like one terrible example after another. The redlining, the
Jim Crow and lynching, etc.,
etc., and so forth. And it's like, well, when has the government actually done the right thing? Well, here now, I think. I mean, we're going to see how it plays itself out, but
at least on paper, they are speaking, and they're not circling around it. They're speaking directly to it, which is one of the things I find particularly interesting. And I'll be honest with you, somewhat surprising that they're not mincing words. They're just coming out and saying it in black and white, in print.
Well, and it also speaks to like who these people are. Like, if we actually go through them, like half of them are black, half of them are my age, and half of them are from the Bronx. Like these are. That's why when you talk about the government in a sense is a fiction. It's just us. It's people at the end of the day. Okay. So then,
and interesting, we have that phrase, popularized by the Lincoln quote, but it is government of the people, by the people, and most importantly, for the people. And this is a act of legislation from just what we've covered so far that clearly seems to be remembering that is one of the components of what government is here. It is for the people.
Create new industries. Protect the environment. Okay, that's something that you and I haven't been talking about much, is that the environmental implications and how the tax revenue and other things could be used to have a conversation about climate change and climate disaster and whatnot, which is a subject that I avoid because I haven't really thought through all of those implications, and I don't really know what the solution is this is tied. The legislature explicitly made environmentalism part of the conversation, so that's something to be aware of.
It's kind of eye-opening. I'll be honest, in our discussions, I was looking at it just in terms of the legal implication and the revenue possibilities.
Right.
And I was like, wait, climate change?
Well, but then like the biggest criticism of AOC's Green New Deal is that it's like just totally unworkable from a financial standpoint. But now we actually have some money where we can. There was a lot of problems with the Green New Deal, right? In terms of, I don't think that was a thoroughly well thought out piece of legislation like this. However, with all of this revenue that we can expect to see, maybe it's time to revisit that legislation, redraft that legislation.
And full disclosure, I'm not really that familiar with the Green New Deal. I consider it, like many things, a blanket proposal. I haven't looked at it or read it because, as you know, my take on things is more from an entrepreneurial point of view than a political point of view. So, which is one of the things I find interesting in being in this partnership, is paying more attention to politics, other than a discussion with people who are on the other side of the aisle that I disagree with. Because I got to be honest, up until recently, that's what it's been for me, particularly on social media. And
an abstract discussion with people that you disagree with on like what are we really talking about?
Right. You know, what are the practical considerations? How would we implement the solution? In fact, are we talking about a solution, or is it just simply knives out? You know, we're trying to cut heads. And
this is a racist country. Well, what does that mean? Okay, well, the marijuana legislation has disproportionately affected black people. Okay, can't argue with that.
Right.
When we talked about race in the past, it's like, you know, we butted heads.
Broad strokes, general, high level, nothing specific. Yeah. And how are you going to come to any sort of conclusion when you're not really discussing anything factual?
Exactly. This is factual and specific. Okay, so new industries protect the environment, improve the state's resiliency to climate change. Again, that's climate change is real, man. You know, and it's time to
last week.
It's time for everybody to start thinking about that, as uncomfortable as it may be.
British Columbia was in the 120s.
It was 100 degrees here not a few days ago, and I could barely leave the apartment. It was hot in the apartment with the AC. On. Protect the public health, safety, and welfare of the people of the state. Increase employment and strengthen New York's agriculture sector. I feel like there's a lot of sectors that could be strengthened by this beyond the agriculture sector. But
focusing on one, there's a lot of farmland. In fact, we were having a discussion last week in terms of the appeal to conservatives. How many so-called red states are farmland states? You know, which are either being subsidized to not grow things, or they're suffering because.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So then maybe that is, you know, we can really improve the agricultural sector by incentivizing farmers
to actually grow. What's the term that you were using when you first started having this conversation? Cash crop.
Yes, that is right. This is a cash crop. You know. Okay, so that's what they found, right? Now they're moving on to the next paragraph. Nothing in this act is intended to limit the authority of any district, government agency, or office or employers to enact and enforce policies pertaining to cannabis in the workplace. To allow I'm going to finish this whole thing and then we'll talk about this paragraph because it's a short paragraph. To allow driving under the influence of cannabis, to allow individuals to engage in conduct that endangers others, to allow smoking cannabis in any location where smoking tobacco is prohibited, or to require any individual to engage in any conduct that violates federal law, or to exempt anyone from any requirement of federal law, or pose any obstacle to the federal enforcement of federal law. To the last point, that has to do with the fact that it's legal in some jurisdictions and it's not legal in other jurisdictions. So you know, there's nothing in this act that says it's okay to sell marijuana in a state where it's not legal.
Right.
Where it becomes more complicated is, what if you want to mail marijuana to Colorado, a state where it's legal? You got to go through all these jurisdictions where it's illegal.
Crossing state lines and all of this sort of consideration.
You know, so the way they drafted this is like they're kind of, I don't think that's the most important concern for them. If this statute is interpreted very conservatively, then that will be illegal. Then it's illegal to mail marijuana from New York to Colorado. We'll see what happens when people try to do that.
It sounds to me that that's kind of a federal government leave us the hell alone paragraph.
Well, isn't it more like we'll respect the federal law?
Well, yeah, no. This is what I mean. It's so that it's like, don't put us under a because you know.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Don't put us under a microscope.
Exactly.
You know, right? I get you because we got you, feds. We're respecting the federal law, and then
states' rights, right?
You know, the other thing is like what it's saying about employers and government agencies is like, I don't know what that means. I think what it really means is like whatever the drug policies are now can remain in force.
Exactly.
So if an employer wants to test you for marijuana and discipline you for positive results, whereas they had the right to do that in the past, they continue to have the right. I do have a little bit of a problem with that, I gotta say, because if marijuana stays in, they don't have like a blood alcohol content test. Like I can't, if you can breathe into a breathalyzer and know if that person is intoxicated right now.
Right.
Marijuana tests see if you've smoked marijuana in the past month. So you can't test for acute marijuana intoxication in any given moment. So I don't know if I want employers to have the right to suspend or discipline people simply because they smoke marijuana. Under the loosest interpretation of this statute, I think that employers do have that power, as they did before the legislation was passed.
Yes, I've worked in the corporate world, and upon being onboarded as a corporate employee, taking a urine test is pretty much a common practice in most corporate places. And again, to Sean's point about how accurate these are, I mean, urine tests only test for the presence of metabolants. They don't test for actual current intoxication. They test whether you have smoked weed, not whether you smoked weed 20 minutes ago. Whereas a breathalyzer test says, okay, right now your blood alcohol content is such that you shouldn't be driving that car. Full disclosure, anyone who was a pothead like I was in the past, let me just tell you, for my first corporate jobs, if those tests were accurate and if it wasn't possible for you to take system cleansers, I would never have started my. There's no reason for me to say this. I'm just being honest, folks, and this speaks to Sean's point. If we're going to enforce that paragraph and continue that going forward, what we need more accurate tests.
Right.
You need to test whether someone is high on weed right now, not whether they smoked weed 3 days ago, because that's none of your damn business.
Yeah,
just like if they went out to the bar with some friends and they had a 6-pack. As long as they don't show up to work drunk to drive your forklift, that's all you have any right to even be concerned with.
But I don't think smoking marijuana affects your ability to drive a forklift the way alcohol does.
That's a nuanced conversation, and that needs more science to
That's
get
what
into.
I was going to say. That before we start, imposing penalties on smoking marijuana in the workplace or while driving, you have to demonstrate to me that there's there is impairment. And
to your point, we couldn't even think about having that conversation while marijuana was illegal, because it's just against the law.
Yeah.
And so I can do whatever the hell I want. But now that's not the argument. It's like, okay, your argument, just as with alcohol intoxication, is, are you impaired? What defines impaired by marijuana? Do we really know that? No, we don't, because we've been having this hysterical, all or nothing attitude towards it. Now that we're not doing that anymore, let's, just as we did with alcohol, we have blood alcohol levels. It's not just, did you drink a beer? How much did you drink? How intoxicated are you? Are you intoxicated to the point of impairment? Now, of course, if you're driving heavy machinery, I don't want you to be impaired at all.
But whereas that's necessary with alcohol, I personally don't think that that's going to be necessary with marijuana.
And currently now, no one can say.
But like you're saying, we can have that at least explore. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, let's look at it. Let's do the
look
science.
At it. Let's find out. I may be right. I may be wrong. Let's do the science.
I'd say you're not neither right nor wrong. Just as with alcohol, there's probably a level. And what is the level? If you took a couple of hits, if you smoked a Cheech and Chong sized bong and walked out in a cloud of smoke, I mean, where's the margin?
But I wouldn't mind, like, even if I was dealing with like a doctor who smoked a joint before, as long as he does his job.
Yeah, doctor doing a diagnosis is one thing. I don't want my surgeon spliffing up before he cuts.
Maybe that's what he needs to do. You're right. And actually, sir, that. Right, and actually, that's what that section of the statute says. Is that it says that the medical boards can issue their own rules about marijuana intoxication.
Yes.
So
but let's have some rules and not this just say no mentality.
Right.
Let's actually approach it scientifically as we have with alcohol.
One final paragraph. A short paragraph, and then we're done with the legislative findings. The legislature further finds and declares that it is in the best interest of the state to regulate medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, cannabinoid hemp, and hemp extracts under independent entities known as the Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management. Before you comment, those three, medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, cannabinoid hemp, they have very specific meanings in the in the statute. So, the next section is all of the definitions,
Right.
but I just wanted, since those three words are used and they're
Specifically
defined in the
referenced.
statute, medical cannabis has a very obvious meaning. That means cannabis, as defined in this section, intended for a certified medical use as determined by the board in consultation with the Commissioner of Health. Cannabis that's prescribed.
Right.
Right? Very obvious. What does cannabis mean? Cannabis, so they use different words to describe different,
Right.
like flower, extra. Cannabis basically means everything. All parts of the plant of the genus cannabis, whether growing or not. And then it goes on and uses exhaustive language to just make sure that everything is
Right.
included.
We're very clear and specific as to what we're talking about.
Cannabinoid, right. But cannabis, when you hear cannabis in the statute, that means everything from CBD oil to, to flour, to extracts, to food items, to the oil that you put in your hair. It means everything.
Right.
Cannabinoid hemp means any hemp and any product processed or derived from hemp that is used for human consumption, provided that when such product is packaged or offered for retail sale to consumer, it shall not have a concentration of more than 0.3% delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which means CBD.
Right.
CBD or hemp or oil, like cooking
Right.
oil that people sometimes use.
Right.
It's intended for human consumption, but it's not getting you high.
Exactly.
Hemp extracts means all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, everything, right? But with a delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol concentration of not more than an amount determined by the Office in Regulation. For the purpose of this article, hemp extract includes any food ingredient, or food additive that is generally recognized as safe pursuant to federal law, or any hemp extract that is not used for human consumption. Such excluded substances shall not be regulated pursuant to the provisions of this article, but are subject to other provisions of applicable state law, rules, and regulations. So I think what that means is like oil that you would
Right.
put in your hair, for
Right.
instance, but not CBD.
Right.
And they haven't necessarily determined exactly what the
Right.
THC content is. I went into all of that just because, I just rattled off those three words.
Right.
But even if I didn't, I think they're essentially sticking to the common usage of the words. There's
Right.
nothing really too exotic there. All right. That's the end of the legislative findings and intent. What do you think? What do you think about that? Did they miss anything? Because I think they missed two things.
Okay. As I mentioned, I am actually kind of surprised that they were as specific about certain things that they were. It was kind of illuminating to consider the climate aspects of it. I wasn't thinking about it in those terms at all. I was thinking about it of basically, in fact, even what you went down, I wasn't thinking about CBD. I don't know from CBD. I went straight edge before that really started being popular. I hear about it. I know people use it. I have no idea how it's used, what its effect is. I was a pothead. I, got high all day, every day, and I smoked weed because I liked being intoxicated on marijuana. So that's the aspect of it I know. And I'm thinking of it in terms of make it legal so that people don't have to get arrested because they got a joint on them. Legalize it so that the people who sell it and distribute it can have a legitimate business and can structure it such that they can have something to leave on to their kids other than a prison record and a bill for the funeral. And increase the revenue to the state. Come on, Colorado, the Evanston, Illinois model of applying tax revenue to address social equity and injustices, that's kind of, we're in the shadow of that.
Yes.
Now, beyond that,
and we've spelled out, New York has spelled out the social equity and the
Right.
and the racial justice components well, they spelled it out more in the legislative finding and intent, and they spell it out throughout the statute
Yes.
much more than they do in other jurisdictions as well. I think they missed the one very important thing that I think they missed is, and I think they did this on purpose, is creating healing between the community and law enforcement.
Okay.
ACAB, defund the
yeah.
police. There's an intense hostility towards the police from the communities mentioned, and I think just people generally.
Yeah.
Right. That's why there's been so much unrest and so many protests for the past year. It's not just because Black and Spanish people are angry at the cops. It's
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of anger and frustration directed towards the police. part of that is because, well, yeah, the cops will harass you for smoking a joint, which is complete nonsense. So it's like if one, and I believe Illinois spells this out in more detail. It's like you want to one benefit that you want to see accrue from the legislation is, well, now the cops don't have to waste their time with this nonsense, and they can actually do their jobs. And you'll also and people don't have to feel so apprehensive about the police because they can kind of relax and smoke a joint in front of them and not worry that they're going to be harassed. So that was the relationship between law enforcement and the citizenry, I think, and bringing healing to that relationship is something that was missed in the legislation. And like I said, I think they did that on purpose because they're like, well, you know, that was not their focus and intent.
Because my question upon hearing that, I don't disagree with you, but it's like, how does an act of legislation spell that out or address that?
I should have, I guess, brought the Illinois statute.
We can address that next
issue. That's a good question because the Illinois statute. Well, the Illinois introduction and legislative finding and intent was essentially just like 2 sentences that says, you know, existing marijuana. I mean, and I'm paraphrasing. I'll have the language of the legislation.
We'll just that next episode. So
next episode. But basically, they say, you know, that the laws have just created intense conflict between the community and law enforcement, and this way, you know, resources in the police department can be focused on better things. Yeah. So that's how you do that. To answer your question,
you're not going to spell out, you know, book, chapter, and verse details, but you're going to address the fact that is the intent
as one point, as among many, right? But Illinois then didn't get into all of the other stuff that I said. They simply say that, right? So certainly the New York statute is more comprehensive and covers a lot more. So
that's one point. What is the other point you feel is?
The other point, and this is, I think, secondary, and I don't know if it's even fair to say that they missed it, but I think that the marijuana legislation has now, the criminalization has lumped marijuana in the same class as all serious drugs. And I think that has exacerbated addictions to the more serious drugs and made treatment more complicated and difficult. Because if you're addicted to heroin and you switch to marijuana, you're still a drug addict. You're still in violation of the law.
And this leads to one of the most specious arguments I've ever heard is the whole bullshit, pardon my language, gateway drug argument, which is sheer nonsense. Let me just say this. Like I said, I was a pothead from when I was 17 and a half to when I was 56. Anyone who's being honest about it knows that potheads don't hang out with junkies. In fact, nobody hangs out with junkies because they're going to steal your shit to get their next high. Potheads also don't hang out too much with cokeheads because they're too fucking jittery and amped up. Potheads want to hang out with mellow people. And I've never seen heroin. I've seen people who were junkies. I've never literally been in a room with heroin. So all this nonsense about because you smoke pot, I'm going to end up sticking needles in my arm. Bullshit.
Well, like I said, I've abused every drug known to civilized man, and what I've found in treatment is that they basically say you're either 100% sober off of everything, or you're it's the same thing as being a crackhead,
which is nuts.
Well, it's nuts. So you're a heroin addict, you detox from heroin, you get sober, you go through the whole recovery process, you get sober for a year, and then you start smoking marijuana. And you go to your NA or AA meeting, and they say, "Well, you got to count days again. It's just like you shot up." And it's like, with that, then it reinforces this attitude where it's like, "Well, if I smoke marijuana, might as well."
In for a penny, in for a pound.
Right. I think that's been so. I there's probably not enough science to back up what I've just said for the legislature to include it in the statute, but I do think that it's. It is something that we should consider, and they do consider having a new conversation around drug treatment, and they spell that out in subsequent chapters. But that's those are the 2 points. The one being the community relations between law enforcement. Yes. That's my only major criticism of this section. I think they could have included that. All right, so then they get into the next article, the next section of they just get into all these definitions. Right. We're gonna pass over that for now, and we're going to at least begin to explore Article 2. which introduces the New York State Cannabis Control Board.
Okay.
This is a deep and complex article. It has like 14 subsections or whatever. Okay, so we're probably not
going to do them all today.
The way I think we should approach our conversation is as you're starting to get, I think, bored or whatever that means our audience is. So, well, I'm just saying, at the point where you know, you're...
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling a little overload.
Overload, then it's, you know...
I say we can see the introduction of this article and maybe the first section, and that'll probably stick a pin in it for today.
All right. The introduction to this whole thing, though, that I want to get into before I begin to digest the language is a few things. One, the Cannabis Control Board is actually 3 agencies. It's not just one agency. So it's the Cannabis Control Board itself.
Right.
Then there's the Office of Cannabis Management, which is essentially the executive wing of the Cannabis Control Board. They're the ones who are doing the actual like hard work, you know, processing the applications, making recommendations to the control board. You'll see what their responsibilities are, but they're subordinate to the Cannabis Control Board. So the Cannabis Control Board is the top regulatory agency, and then there's also the State Cannabis Advisory Board, and they essentially just, you know, analyze things and make recommendations to the control board and to the legislature. There are 3 ways, I think, to go about cannabis legalization. One is the pure libertarian, laissez-faire. It's legal.
Have at it, folks.
Have at it, folks. No regulation. Obviously, that's not. And then, then the other is to create an independent board, which is what New York did, and the other is to give new powers to existing boards, like the liquor board. So now it's not a liquor board, it's the liquor and marijuana board. And I think other states kind of take a mixed approach. California's taken a mixed approach. New York has now created this entire agency within
so like running in parallel to things like the liquor board or something like that, but it's going to be its own separate independent entity.
Well, then there is crossover with the liquor board. You'll see. So this is where things get a little bit complicated. And, you know, as far as the marijuana operator is concerned, you know, this stuff is relevant. You know, you have to know who's giving you the license. If you're denied a license, what's the appeals process? Who are these people? How did they reach a decision? You know, what's going on here? So the establishment of the Cannabis Control Board or board. So we can,
is the board. When I say the board, that's what they're talking about.
The Cannabis Control Board is hereby created. That's it. That's how you create something with a statute. You speak it and it comes into being, and shall consist of a chairperson nominated by the governor and with the advice and consent of the Senate, with 1 vote. And so you know, that's the chairperson.
Right.
He has more power and authority than the other members, but he still just has 1 vote. Okay. And 4 other voting board members as provided for in subdivision 2 of this section. So we're going to
get to that.
Right, and eminently, right now. Appointments. In addition to the chairperson, the governor shall have 2 direct appointments. So there's 5 people, right? So there's the board and then 4 other people, okay? The governor gets to appoint the chairperson, and he has 2 other direct appointments on the board. So actually the governor can kind of control what's happening.
Can stack the board, so to speak.
He can stack the board. Yeah, that's right. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Yeah, I want the governor to be able to kind of, you know, whether he's a Republican, whether he's a Democrat, I want him to be able to put, you know, his people in there.
It's a statewide board.
Yeah, right. And then the temporary president of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly shall each have 1 direct appointment to the board. Do you know what the temporary president of the Senate is?
I have no idea. I've never even heard that term.
But that's very interesting, and I have a confession to make. I didn't either. And every time I confront something that I don't know, the world makes a little less sense. You know, no, it's something. Well, when I came across that, I went to law school. You'd think that I should know exactly what that is, but it speaks to how every state has its own mechanics, its own ways. Like we said, Robert's Rules of Order is how you go about a parliamentary process, but that doesn't mean that every state isn't going to have, you know, some of its own
variant of process.
So the temporary president is usually, but not always, the same thing as the Senate Majority Leader. You know what is Senate majority?
Yes.
Right. So if the Democrats now are controlling
the United States Congress,
and also
and the United States Senate,
and the New York.
Right. In the state of New York.
So they get to have the what they would call the difference between the temporary president and the Senate majority leader. Like I said, usually it's the same person with both of those titles.
Right.
There are circumstances where we're not going to get into that. The point to understand is
it's possible for them to be two separate people.
It is
usually and typically it's the same person.
The point is that if it's the person in charge of the Senate, which is of the New York Senate, which is the just like Congress, there's two houses. There's also two houses in the New York legislature as well, and the other one is the New York State Assembly is the lower house of the New York State Legislature, and the Speaker of the Assembly is like the temporary president. That's the leader of the State Assembly.
Right.
Very simple. Okay.
Makes sense.
So they each get one appointment.
Okay.
Right. So the governor essentially gets 3, and then
each house
gets one.
Okay.
And I'd like to think that this goes to the whole kind of American theory of checks and balances and whatnot. When it comes to a government agency like this, I just want to see them do their jobs. I don't want there to be and that's why I'm trying to focus the conversation as much as possible on collaboration and cooperation between the Democrats and the Republicans, and I hope that that's what ends up happening, and that they're not fighting with each other in the board, because if that starts happening, that's going to be a problem. All right. Appointments shall be for a term of 3 years each, and should, to the extent possible, be geographically and demographically representative of the state and communities historically affected by the war on drugs. But how is that possible with 5 appointments?
Members. Yeah, there's a lot more counties in New York than that.
Right, and I guess they can kind of appoint whoever they want, but it's the legislature's way of, I think, gently nudging them to say, hey, now's an opportunity for us to put, again, people of color, people who have been disproportionately impacted by it's their attempt to blue line the red line, I think, to give, to the extent that they're creating new political offices, they're trying to prioritize those seats for communities of color. I notice I'm trying to dance around that. I'm trying to find more intelligent ways of saying communities of color, because I don't want things to be about race. I wish we lived in a post-racial society, but we don't. So this is that. So that's appointment. Okay. Board members shall be citizens and permanent residents of the state.
Makes sense.
It's not the case in all of the other jurisdictions, but the chairperson and the remaining members of such board shall continue to serve as chairperson and members of the board until the expiration of the respective terms. So then it kind of goes into how long they're supposed to be there for, and what happens if one dies or whatever. Then they get into their compensation. This I thought was weird. The members, except for the chairperson, shall, when performing the work of the board, be compensated at a rate of $260 per day. That's what the board gets paid, with the exception of the chair, and together with an allowance for actual and necessary expenses incurred in the discharge of their duties. The chairperson shall receive an annual salary not to exceed an amount appropriated therefor by the legislature. So what is it? What are they? The legislature can pick the chair's salary. The other guys are getting $260 a day.
$260 a day. Boom.
Which, it's good work when you can get it. That's not bad. No member or member's spouse or minor child shall have any interest in an entity regulated by the board. Now, they get into much more detail in later sections about conflicts of interest. Basically, and I don't know how I feel about this. I'm curious how you feel about this. Because actually, this is an important point to dwell on for a minute. Why can't members of the board... Basically, what they're saying, and they get into this later, is if you're on the board, your family, you cannot have any interest in the marijuana industry. You have to be totally... you can't have, stock. You can't be in a company or have... they get into it later, like I said, but... if you work for a company that has a stock interest in the marijuana industry, that's a problem.
Right.
So is that...
Well, this is an advisory board, right?
No, this is
So this or is this the control board?
this is the control board.
Okay, this
This
is
is not the advisory board.
So I could see that, because if you're the one who makes the rules, and you have a vested financial interest, are you going to be making the best rules, or are you going to be making the rules to put money in your pocket? That's the whole point of dealing against. And look, we've seen enough in terms of the United States Senate to know that if you let people cross those lines...
But they cross those lines all the time. Those rules aren't as explicit and you know...
Perhaps that's why they're making them explicit here. And also,
Yeah,
perhaps
that's true.
they're trying to anticipate and do an end run around objections that people are going to make in order to stifle and stymie what's going on here.
But I kind of want to play devil's advocate. I want someone on that board to have some skin in the game and to understand the industry. And I don't think that it necessarily... I think you would have to prove conflict of interest on a case-by-case basis, you know?
Yeah, well, let's just be frank, this is a presumption of corruption before purity in
Yes.
making rules like this. I think, however, there's enough anecdotal evidence and empirical observation of human behavior to pretty much say that if you allow for conflict of interest, undesirable things are going to happen.
I get, you know what though, whatever argument I might have made to the contrary, they weighed those arguments,
Yeah.
They made a determination, this is the direction that they want to go. I'm simply playing devil's advocate because I think the conservative voices might have some objections here, but you know, how many conservatives have equity interest in the marijuana industry? So I don't think that even the conservatives are not going to come back at this that hard.
Yeah.
But this is a point around which I think the conservatives could potentially buck a little bit.
Yeah.
Expenses, each member of the board shall be entitled to their expenses. They get reimbursed for their
Right.
expenses.
Well, that's kind of reasonable. You know,
Removal. The next section they can be removed for cause. We don't need to get into that.
Yeah.
The next section deals with vacancies and a quorum. All right. I don't think we need to go through all of that, but I'll just read each of the sections so that you know kind of. So vacancies, quorum, you know, what to do in the event of a vacancy caused by death, right? You know, for the chairperson, and then how quorum rules and voting rules. And again, I think you should consult Robert's Rules of Order if you're really interested in understanding how parliamentary procedure works.
right. And all of this, pertaining to this specific bill, will have more relevance once there's actually a board. Right now, this is high-level stuff, and what we're concerned with is, what does the law look like? How is it going to affect things? What's the practical reality? Not what are the rules of when they're bringing together the board meeting and how many is a quorum.
No, what's more important than that is what are the criteria around which they're going to issue the licenses.
Exactly.
That we need to understand. And that actually, the subsequent sections do speak to our basic philosophy that if you're applying as a social equity applicant and you're able to demonstrate your community involvement, that is something that they're going to look at.
Okay.
And they're going to spell that out. But that's the section that deals with social equity applicants. We'll get there later. Number 6. The Cannabis Control Board and Office of Cannabis Management shall have its principal office in the city of Albany. That's the capital, right? And maintain branch offices in the cities of New York, right here, and Buffalo, and such other places as it may deem necessary. That's just that, but it lets you know if we're speaking primarily to the 5 boroughs. The board is going to have an office within the 5 boroughs, right here, so that we can, if they, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, if they do something totally outrageous, that we can show up to their office and protest here in the city without getting on a bus to Albany.
The rights to peacefully assemble and redress grievances against the government.
But this is why I want to come together for the purposes of collective bargaining.
Yes.
It's not to harass them. That's why I said I shouldn't. I actually have a lot of confidence that they're going to do the right thing and that it's not going to come to that. But at least we know where to find them if.
And here's the thing: we don't have to go to their offices just because we're displeased. What if they do something we consider as particularly exemplary?
Right.
We
Right.
can go there and
Exactly.
just give them an attaboy and say, hey, good job.
The board. This
I'm waiting
is
to see that happen. I must admit, that's the cynical New Yorker in me talking, but let's hope.
I'm cynical too, but this legislation is so clearly like which the only way it could go south is just if the people who end up implementing it do not actually do what it says to do.
Right.
They do the opposite of
Right.
what's written.
Well,
in here.
I will take that a step further. The way that it really could not go far is if we, the people,
Thank you.
don't
Thank
ensure
you.
that
Yeah.
those people do what they're supposed
Thank
to
you.
do.
And that speaks to our other basic philosophy is that we have to take responsibility
Yes.
here. That the government they're getting out of our way. They're doing they're creating processes that ostensibly are going to work in our favor, but at the end of the day, we have to be the ones
Right,
to
right.
to.
And
to-
I'm going to repeat something that I say. I may end up saying this in every episode, but the root word of reparations is repair. And the responsibility for making the repairs is on us, those who have been affected. This is not a bill of salvation. We don't need any goddamn saviors. What we need is to have a process whereby we can make the repairs that need to be made.
And I'll tell you one process right now is the charitable contributions that I keep talking about.
There you
If
go.
marijuana is illegal and you make a charitable contribution out of the money that you earned illegally, you will not be able to get a tax credit
Right.
at the end of the year. Now that marijuana is illegal, you can. So if you have a problem with paying a third of your, or however much
Right.
of your income in taxes to the state, to do with it what you will, take control of that.
Right.
Direct that money where you want. How do you blue line the red line? You tell me.
And fascinatingly, not only are you right, this kind of circles us back to where we were at the beginning of the conversation. That's pretty much I'm not going to call him by my favorite nickname for him, but this is Justice Thomas's point, because particularly what he was criticizing about the federal government is that states where marijuana is legal, those businesses don't get the same federal tax consideration and benefits that other businesses and other industries get.
That's
because the
interesting.
IRS, according to their tax codes, marijuana is still federally illegal.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that. That's like that reminds me of what was happening when there was inconsistencies around the drinking age.
Right.
So the way that the federal government was enforcing a 21 or over drinking age was by tax incentives, like you're talking
Right.
about. Like if your drinking age was under 21, then you didn't get all of this discretionary
Right.
money that other states were getting. And you're not talking about a few bucks here. You're talking about millions and millions
yeah.
of dollars. So, that's a lot of incentive.
Yeah.
So, all right. Moving on, the last thing we said was their offices are going to be in New York and Buffalo. This is very important, the next thing I'm going to read. The board shall establish appropriate procedures to ensure that hearing officers are shielded from ex parte communications. Do you know what that word means?
No, I do not.
All right, I'm going to tell you. From ex parte communications with alleged violators and their attorneys, and from other employees of the Office of Cannabis Management, and shall take other steps as it shall deem necessary and proper to shield its judicial processes from unwarranted and inappropriate communications and attempts to influence. Ex parte means one party, essentially. Like if I'm trying to think of an example. During the communist witch hunts, a lot of the evidence that was presented to the tribunals was done where the accused could not present their evidence.
Ah.
That's what ex parte communication. It's you're the judge, and I'm talking to you, and I'm presenting evidence to you, and the other party doesn't have an opportunity to respond and whatnot. So that's
Okay.
so it's essentially means undue influence. So
Right.
ultimately, the Cannabis Board is going to have tribunals. They're going to have fact finding. Responsibilities, and there is going to be hopefully protocols in place to make sure that the proceedings are transparent and according to basic principles of justice.
Right.
You know.
Right. And I don't know. What do you think? I think that's a pretty good place to stick a pin in it for this episode. Was there something else you wanted to read before?
Well, okay. Let's go. Let's finish this section.
Okay.
Okay, because we're on. It is a good point to stick a pin in it. But let me just remind you kind of where we're at here. You know, this is the establishment of the Cannabis Control Board, and the next section is the establishment of an Office of Cannabis Management.
Okay.
So let's finish up with the section of the Cannabis Control Board,
okay.
And then when we get to the Office of Cannabis Management, we'll.
Right. Okay.
But like I warned you, this is a kind of meaty section, and this is not easy.
No, but that's a good
stuff.
logical place to take a break. So let's finish up with the board.
Okay, so where was I here?
Ex parte.
Yes, okay. And actually, we're almost there. Section 8. One more paragraph. You're actually right. One more paragraph, and then we're at the establishment of an Office of Cannabis Management.
Okay.
As distinguished from the board. Okay. So the final section is disqualification of members of the board and employees of the Office of Cannabis Management. We don't have to read this whole section because it's just exhaustive language to say that you cannot, if you are on the board, you can't have this interest, that interest, another interest, or any interest at all. And it spells out all the different ways because you have to be explicit.
Sounds kind of like Leviticus.
Except upon the written permission, this is the final sentence, upon the written permission of the board, such member of the board or employee thereof may hold the public office of notary public. You know what a notary is?
Oh, yeah.
So you have to get written permission from the board.
To even be a notary.
To even be a notary. Or member of a community board of education in the city school district of the city of New York. Anyone who violates any of the provisions of this section shall be removed. So you can't, have any interest in a business where cannabis or hemp extract is sold, manufactured, distributed, transported, and it's several paragraphs and sections of that. The next sections go into the.
So basically, they want you to just say no if you're a member of the control board.
And you're right. I think that is a good place for us to wrap up. For this episode, and then the next episode we'll start to get into the Office of Cannabis Management and the powers and duties, and then it gets into the powers and duties of the Office of Cannabis Management and the Control Board and the various officers, and then one thing that I'd like you to just bear in mind is one appointment. Is the chief equity officer. The other jurisdictions, I think New York is I don't want to say this and be wrong, but I think that New York is the only jurisdiction that has a chief equity officer to ensure that there's that those provisions of the statute are complied with. So, all right, sir, good work, and tune in next time.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much.
All right, and we'll see you next week.